The wire went up in the spring of 1943, and by the following year it had become something else entirely. What began as a rearguard position scratched into the volcanic soil of central Italy had grown, through 18 months of German engineering labor, into a continuous belt of steel and concrete stretching 14 miles across the Liri Valley, from the slopes of the Ortona Mountains in the west to the heights above the Melfa River in the east. The Germans called it the Senger Line, named for the corps commander whose sector it anchored. The Allies, because they understood the psychological value of a name, called it the Hitler Line, and the name stuck because it said precisely what it was meant to say: a position from which there would be no withdrawal, a line drawn in concrete by a regime that had built its entire military culture around the performance of will over circumstance. It ran along the base of hills the color of dried clay, through farmland that had been terraced by generations of Italian families who had since fled, past stone villages that sat empty behind their walls. Steel turrets housing 75mm guns had been sunk flush into the ground at intervals of 300 yards. Panther tank turrets, stripped from their hulls and mounted on concrete plinths, covered the approaches with overlapping fields of fire that allowed no dead ground within 400 yards of the wire. Machine gun positions were cut into the reverse slopes of low ridges where no shell fired from the south could reach them without a trajectory that the defenders' own engineers had calculated and accounted for. Minefields 40 yards deep lay in front of the wire, and the wire itself was triple-strand, 100 yards thick in the densest sections, anchored by iron stakes driven into ground so hard that the men who built the thing had worn out multiple sets of drill bits getting the stakes to hold. The engineers who designed it believed, with some reason, that it could not be broken in a frontal assault without casualties that would stop the attacker before the second line of positions was reached. The men who built it were not wrong about the concrete. They were wrong about something else. If this story is pulling you in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who's listening. On the morning of May 23, 1944, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division and the 5th Canadian Armoured Division lined up in front of that wire. They had been fighting in Italy since the previous July, from the beaches of Sicily through the rubble of Ortona, through the mud of the Arieli Valley, and the grinding stalemate of the winter line positions that had held the Allied advance for 5 months in the most difficult terrain in the Mediterranean. They knew what German defensive positions looked like from the inside of an assault. They had paid for that knowledge in blood that can be measured precisely because the record survived. 365 killed at Ortona alone in the fighting through December of 1943, house by house through a coastal town that the Canadians were never going to be permitted to bypass. What they did not know on the morning of May 23rd, because no prisoner had yet told them and no reconnaissance photograph could show it, was the state of the men waiting for them behind the concrete. That knowledge would come later, in the interrogation cages set up behind the Canadian lines, in the hours and days after the battle ended. And what the German prisoners said in those cages, to the intelligence officers who recorded their words in the unit war diaries and after-action reports that still sit in the archives in Ottawa, is not what anyone on either side of the wire expected to hear. It did not fit the standard account of how fortified positions fall. It did not fit the account that the official histories would later construct around the battle. It fits something else, the pattern of what happens when professional soldiers are given enough time in a prepared position to understand, accurately and against orders, their own situation. To understand what happened on May 23rd, and what the prisoners said about it afterward, you need to understand what the Hitler Line actually was as a military object, and what it was supposed to do within the larger architecture of the German defense of Italy. The Winter Line, the series of fortifications anchored on Monte Cassino, had held the Allied advance for 5 months. When it finally broke in mid-May of 1944, breached partly because the French Expeditionary Corps, under General Alphonse Juin, crossed terrain through the Ortona Mountains that the German command had judged impassable by any force capable of fighting when it arrived, the German 10th Army began a withdrawal that was never going to be fast enough to make use of the positions prepared for it. The Hitler Line was the backstop. It was the position where the withdrawal was supposed to stop, where the 10th Army was supposed to consolidate, and where the Allied advance was supposed to bleed out against prepared defenses while the German command bought time to stabilize the front further north toward Rome. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy with a thoroughness and adaptability that his Allied counterparts, consistently underestimated, had staked a considerable portion of his operational planning on that calculation. The Hitler Line was his insurance policy for the summer of 1944, and it had been paid for in full. Concrete, steel, engineering expertise, months of labor, and the strategic logic of a position that covered the shortest road to Rome from the south. The unit assigned to hold the critical central sector of the Hitler Line was the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division. This was not a collection of rear-area troops or elderly reservists pulled together to fill a gap in the line, the kind of improvised garrison that the Canadians had encountered at various points in Sicily and Italy and found brittle under sustained pressure because it had never been designed to hold under sustained pressure. The 90th had been formed from the remnants of German forces evacuated from North Africa, soldiers who had fought across the Western Desert and survived the collapse of the Afrika Korps, been shipped back to Sicily and fought there across that summer, then withdrawn to the mainland and fought through the Sicilian Strait and up through Calabria and Campania. They carried with them a particular kind of hardened competence, the practical knowledge of men who had been in retreating armies before and understood the specific discipline required to turn a rearguard position into a killing ground, to make the attacker pay for ground that the defenders had already been ordered to give up. Their commander, General Lieutenant Ernst Gunther Bode, was known throughout the German army as an eccentric of the highest order and a soldier of exceptional ability in equal measure. He had a habit of wearing a kilt when visiting his forward positions in the Western Desert, a souvenir from the British officer he had taken it from, and he combined this theatricality with a reputation for appearing at the front line at moments when his presence was neither expected nor entirely safe. His men, by the standards of May 1944, were as well prepared as any German infantry unit remaining in Italy. The question of what happened to those men, and what they said about it afterward, begins not on the morning of the assault, but in the 3 weeks before it. The Hitler Line had been under intermittent pressure since mid-May, following the breakthrough at Cassino. Canadian units from the 1st Division had probed the wire, drawn fire, lost men, and pulled back to consolidate while the engineers and the artillery established the precise positions needed for a set-piece assault. Artillery batteries had registered targets on the German side of the line, firing single rounds at identified positions and recording the fall of shot in detail that would allow mass fire to be directed onto specific points of resistance during the assault. For the soldiers of the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division, those 3 weeks were a particular kind of waiting. Not the waiting of a cut-off garrison that has been isolated by a naval blockade and knows no relief is coming. The specific existential dread that had dissolved the Channel port garrisons one by one from Boulogne northward through the autumn of 1944. These men had their divisional headquarters behind them, their supply lines intact, and regular contact with the German command structure that ran up through the 14th Panzer Corps to Kesselring's headquarters at Frascati. They had every material reason to hold their nerve. What eroded it was more subtle, and it came from the same source that had broken men in concrete bunkers hundreds of miles to the north and west. From what they could see, from what they could hear in the systematic way that artillery registration makes itself known to the men it is targeting, and from what they understood about their own position regardless of what the order said about it. The first thing they could see was the scale of what was being assembled in front of them. By the morning of May 23rd, the Canadians had concentrated 800 guns along a front of 3,000 yards. The artillery of the 1st Canadian Corps, augmented by additional guns from the 8th Army's Army Group Royal Artillery, represented the heaviest concentration of firepower the Canadians had yet assembled in the Italian campaign. For a soldier in a prepared position, artillery concentration of that density carried a specific meaning that no training was needed to decode. The enemy had made a decision. This was not a probe or a demonstration. This was the assault, prepared over weeks with a thoroughness that only an attacking force that expected to succeed would invest in. 3 weeks of watching that accumulation build, of hearing the supply columns moving by night on the road south of the Rapido, of seeing the distant dust clouds that meant armored units being brought forward in position for the breach, had done the work that no bombardment could do. The German soldiers in the turret positions and the machine gun nests along the Hitler Line had spent 21 days doing the mathematics that men in enclosed spaces always do when the evidence accumulates around them without any corresponding evidence on the other side of the ledger. They had counted shells and registered the accuracy of the ranging shots. They had listened to the air raids that came with an increasing regularity that indicated a finalizing of preparations rather than a continuation of attrition. They had heard, through the specific and formal channels by which military intelligence travels from man to man faster than any official dispatch, that Cassino had fallen, that the French were through the Urunci Mountains and threatening the German position from a direction the Hitler Line had not been designed to defend against, that the Eighth Army was moving up the Liri Valley with its full weight, and that the Hitler Line was the last prepared position between the Allied advance and Rome. What they had not heard, and this absence is as important as any of the evidence they had accumulated, was anything credible about relief. There was no armored counterattack being assembled in the hills behind them. There was no reserve division moving up to extend the line or thicken the garrison. There was no intelligence reaching them through any channel they trusted, suggesting that the Allied advance could be stopped anywhere south of the Hitler Line, which meant that if the line held, it held alone as the final obstacle rather than one layer of a defense in depth. That knowledge, assembled over 3 weeks of tactical observation by men trained in tactical observation, was the condition of the garrison when the Canadian guns opened at 6 o'clock on the morning of May 23rd. The barrage was the heaviest single concentration of artillery fire the Canadians had yet directed in Italy. 800 guns firing in a timed program. Each battery assigned specific targets, the fire lifting from position to position along the 3,000-yard front, in a sequence designed to keep every identified German position under suppression at the moment the infantry crossed the start line. The guns of the 19th Field Regiment, the 4th Field Regiment, the 23rd Field Regiment, the 98th Anti-Tank Regiment, every barrel that could be brought to bear on that front fired without pause for 45 minutes. The earth inside the Hitler Line shook in a way that the turret crews experienced as a continuous vibration rather than a series of discrete impacts, the individual detonations merging into a physical pressure that pressed against the walls and the floor and the chest of anyone inside a prepared position. The bombardment did not break the defenses. What it did, in a way that no one watching from the Canadian side could have known at the time, was give the German defenders a problem to solve for 45 minutes. And solving that problem, specifically, was precisely what kept them functional for its duration. Under bombardment, the immediate demand on a soldier is survival. Check the wall, check the roof, check the men beside you. Is the position intact? Is the gun still operational? Is anyone wounded? That sequence of concrete questions keeps a mind fully occupied with the present moment. It crowds out the question that 3 weeks of watching the Canadian buildup had planted without resolution in every mind behind the wire. When this stops, what comes next? And is it worth what it costs to resist it? The barrage lifted at 6:45. The infantry went in. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Brigade advanced on the right and center, with the West Nova Scotia Regiment and the Carleton and York Regiment and the Royal 22nd Regiment moving forward behind the final lifting of the guns toward positions that the artillery had been suppressing rather than destroying. What the infantry encountered in the first minutes of the assault was not uniform. Some positions fought with the coherence of trained soldiers defending prepared ground. The Panther turrets, whose armored housing had survived the bombardment entirely intact, put direct fire onto the advancing Sherman tanks of the 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade. In the first hour of the assault, the Canadians lost a significant number of armored vehicles to guns that had not been touched by the barrage. The engineers who had been tasked with cutting lanes through the minefields came under accurate and sustained machine gun fire. 2 companies of the West Nova Scotia Regiment found themselves pinned in the wire by machine guns positioned on the reverse slopes of ridges where no artillery trajectory could find them without register fire that the speed of the assault had not allowed. Men died in the wire in the first hour of May 23rd in ways that recalled every previous assault on prepared positions in 2 wars. But alongside those positions that fought with professional competence, there were others that did not. Intelligence officers attached to the assault brigades noted in their after-action reports, filed within 72 hours of the battle's conclusion, that the resistance along the Hitler Line was uneven in a way that exceeded the normal variance produced by bombardment casualties, differences in the character of individual commanders, or the varying fields of fire available to different positions. Some strongpoints surrendered at the first approach of Canadian infantry. Some surrendered when the follow-up armor arrived, but before any direct fire had been brought against them. In documented cases, machine gun positions that had been firing accurately during the assault phase went silent and offered no resistance when approached from an unexpected direction, rather than the front their fields of fire were oriented toward. The men inside those positions were not wounded. The guns were intact and loaded. The surrender was the choice of men who had already, in some sense that the intelligence officers would spend considerable effort documenting, made that choice before the choice presented itself. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's far more in the record still to cover. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. The interrogations that followed the battle produced a record that the intelligence summary compiled by the 1st Canadian Corps, filed in early June and archived in Ottawa, describes as among the most uniform and consistent bodies of prisoner testimony the Corps intelligence staff had yet encountered. Uniform in this context does not mean that every prisoner said the same things in the same words. It means that the themes and the sequence of reasoning that the prisoners described were consistent across dozens of separate accounts taken independently by different officers from prisoners who had no opportunity to coordinate their testimony. The prisoners were from different units, different companies, different specializations within the garrison, and they were interrogated at different times over a period of 2 days. The consistency of what they said was not the consistency of a rehearsed narrative. It was the consistency of people describing the same underlying experience from their individual positions within it. What the prisoners described divided into 2 related accounts that together form a coherent picture of what the Hitler Line had become from the inside by the time the Canadians crossed the wire. The first account was about time and what time had done to the garrison's assessment of their situation. The 3 weeks between the breach at Casino and the Canadian assault had not been experienced by the defenders as a period of consolidation and preparation for a decisive engagement. They had been experienced, the prisoners said in various formulations that amounted to the same thing, as a period of watching a conclusion approach that the official orders refused to acknowledge. The men of the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division were not men without experience or unit pride. Their service in North Africa and Sicily had given them a framework for understanding what a deteriorating tactical situation looked like from inside it, and what it looked like was closely comparable to what they had been observing in the Liri Valley since the middle of May. The German 10th Army was conducting an ordered withdrawal. Every position south of the Hitler Line had been relinquished in sequence. The line itself was being asked to perform a function that their experience told them no single defensive position could perform when the force it was anchoring had already been broken at its primary defensive line, to serve as a reversal rather than a delay. Soldiers who have been through a large-scale withdrawal understand the distinction. A delaying position is a rearguard action with a defined endpoint, a position held at cost to buy time for a larger maneuver. A reversal position is the final line, the position whose holding changes the strategic equation. The Hitler Line, the prisoners said, had been presented to them as the latter, while everything they could observe told them it was the former. Being ordered to die for a position they believed would not change the outcome, in a campaign they had concluded was already lost, had occupied the minds of those men for 3 weeks before the first Canadian soldier crossed the start line. The second account was about information and its absence. The Hitler Line garrison was not physically isolated. They received orders and they received supply, at least until the Canadian buildup made road movement increasingly difficult in the days immediately before the assault. What they did not receive was any information that contradicted the picture assembled from visible evidence. The official communications from the Corps and Army level above them maintained the tone and language of temporary tactical adjustment, of a defensive line that would hold while broader operational maneuver produced a reversal of the situation. The visible evidence, the scale of the assembly in front of them, the character of the withdrawal through the line from south to north, the absence of any reinforcing formations moving toward them, told a different story. Holding both of those stories simultaneously, being ordered to act on the official account while privately believing the assembled evidence, is a specific and recognized psychological burden that military commanders have documented with some consistency since the First World War. What the Hitler Line prisoners described was the particular form it took in the 5th year of a losing campaign. Not demoralization in the sense of broken spirits and unwillingness to fight, but a precise private calculation, conducted individually and reaching a common conclusion across a significant portion of the garrison. that the fight they were being ordered to make was not worth its cost and any outcome they could construct. One prisoner, a Feldwebel from the 202nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment who had served with the unit since the Western Desert, said something the recording officer underlined in his original notes. He said that by the morning of May 23rd, the men in his position had already decided the line would not hold. The shelling confirmed their assessment. What changed was when they could act on it. That reversal deserves extended attention because it inverts the standard understanding of what a preliminary bombardment accomplishes. The doctrinal function assigned to artillery preparation in the Offensive Operations Manuals current in 1944 on both the Allied and German sides was to break the physical and psychological resistance of the defender before the infantry assault. Shell a position long enough and hard enough, and the men inside it would be too disoriented and too frightened to mount coherent resistance when the infantry arrived. The German prisoners of the Hitler Line described a sequence that ran in the opposite direction. The bombardment, in their collective account, had not broken their will, because their will, in the sense that matters militarily, was already broken before the first shell fell. What the bombardment had done was give them a reason to stay in their positions for the 45 minutes it lasted. Under fire, soldiers stay still. That is not courage or ideological commitment. It is the straightforward calculation of survival. Movement during a bombardment is more dangerous than stillness. The barrage had been keeping them in their positions not because they intended to fight from those positions, but because leaving them during the shelling would have been suicidal. When the barrage lifted, the reason to stay lifted with it. What walked in behind the artillery was not a force they had resolved to fight. It was the moment they had been waiting for. The battle lasted the better part of 2 days. By the evening of May 24th, the Hitler Line had been penetrated at multiple points along the 3,000-yard front, and the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division was withdrawing north in good order, in the sense that it remained a coherent formation rather than a routed mob, toward the next position that Kesselring's headquarters was already preparing. The Canadian casualty figures for the 2 days of the assault record 879 killed, wounded, and missing, a number that sits in the unit war diaries as evidence that the Hitler Line was not a walkover. The German prisoners taken numbered in the thousands across the 2 days, the exact count varying with the source, and the inherent confusion of accounting in the immediate aftermath of a large-scale action. But the after-action reports of the 1st Canadian Corps record over 1,000 prisoners from the Hitler Line defenses, with the surrenders distributed across both days of the battle rather than concentrated in the first hours of the breakthrough. Many of those surrenders occurred in the later phases of the action, men who had remained in their positions through the initial assault, who had in some cases fought for several hours, and who then chose to surrender to follow up infantry rather than withdraw with their units. The interrogation of those later prisoners, men who had fought before they surrendered, provides the clearest picture of what the Hitler Line had become from the inside. One account survives in particularly precise form in the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade records, a statement given on May 25th by a soldier from the 361st Panzer Grenadier Regiment, 23 years old, from Westphalia, who had served in the regiment since the Western Desert. He had been at Alamein and at Mareth. He had crossed to Sicily and fought across the island through the summer of 1943. He had been in Italy from the landing at Reggio Calabria and had fought through every engagement the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division had been committed to in the 18 months since. The intelligence officer's notes describe him as composed, answering questions directly, and appearing to have organized in his own mind the account he intended to give before the questioning began. He said his men had understood, in the weeks before the assault, that the Italian campaign was being lost. Not that this battle would be lost, not that this position would fall, but that the campaign itself had reached a point from which the German strategic position in Italy could not recover by means available to the forces committed to the theater. He said this conclusion had nothing to do with morale in the conventional sense. His men were not cowards, and the battle record bore him out. They had fought in the first hours of the assault with sufficient accuracy and determination to produce the Canadian casualties the day recorded. The issue was simpler and more specific than morale. The issue was purpose. At Alamein, there had been a reason to hold every position that every soldier understood and found credible. At the Hitler Line, he said, he had not been able to identify a purpose that justified the cost. Rome would fall regardless of whether the line held for 2 days or 10. The 10th Army would withdraw regardless. The war would continue to its conclusion regardless of what happened in this valley. He stopped speaking for a moment before adding that he had not voiced these conclusions to his men. He had not needed to. They had reached them independently. The intelligence summary compiled by the 1st Canadian Corps from the full body of Hitler Line prisoner interrogations identified the same themes consistently across the record. The private conclusion that the campaign was lost before the battle began, the disconnection between the official account they had been given and the evidence visible from inside their positions, and the experience of the 3 weeks of waiting as a period of psychological dissolution that the bombardment had briefly interrupted without reversing. The summary's author, writing in the measured language of an intelligence officer who understood his document would be read by senior commanders with their own interpretations to defend, concluded that the Hitler Line's failure could not be attributed primarily to material factors. The concrete had held. The turrets were intact when Canadian engineers examined them after the battle. The minefields had performed their design function and produced significant Canadian casualties. The physical fortification had done broadly what it was built to do. The failure was in the human element, specifically in what 3 weeks of tactical observation had done to men who were professional enough to understand what they were seeing and experienced enough to trust their own assessment of it over the official account they had been given. The pattern that the Hitler Line interrogations document runs through the entire Italian campaign from the summer of 1943 onward, but the Hitler Line provides its clearest single-point articulation. A large body of prisoner testimony, recorded immediately after the battle by officers who understood its unusual character, describing the collapse of a fortified position not as the result of superior physical force, but as the result of superior information. The Canadians had not simply assembled more guns than the Germans had concrete. They had, by assembling that force visibly over 3 weeks of preparation, provided the men behind the concrete with enough evidence to reach a conclusion that the orders governing those men refused to acknowledge. The mechanism was the same one that had operated at Boulogne and Calais and Cap Gris-Nez, at the channel ports where silence and encirclement had dissolved garrisons that bombardment had never touched. The form was different, not silence, but a controlled accumulation of visible evidence, not encirclement, but the progressive disappearance of any credible reason to hold. The result, documented in the same kind of interrogation transcripts and the same kind of intelligence summaries, was the same. Men who were prepared to fight, who did fight, who fought well enough to leave a casualty record that their opponents recorded with the respect that professional soldiers extend to professional opponents, chose not to continue fighting at the moment they were given a safe opportunity to stop. The bombardment and the assault had not made that choice for them. The 3 weeks before the bombardment had made it, and the bombardment and the assault had provided the occasion for a choice already made to be carried out. General-Lieutenant Botta survived the Hitler Line and the withdrawal north, and he continued to command the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division through the long retreating battle up the Italian peninsula that would occupy the next 12 months. He was killed in a vehicle accident in April of 1945, in the last week of the war in Europe, having commanded his division across more than 2 years of continuous retreat and engagement in the hardest fighting in the Mediterranean theater. He left no memoir. What survives are the operational records, the situation reports in which he requested reinforcement during the 3 weeks before the assault and recorded, with the compressed language of a commander who had learned not to argue with orders he knew would not be reversed, that his division was holding a front for which it was numerically insufficient against a force that was numerically and materially superior. Those requests were denied. The reinforcements were not available. The line was held with the men who were there. There is a detail from the assault that deserves particular attention because it appears in multiple independent accounts, and because it says something specific about the character of the collapse that the prisoner testimony describes. When the Royal 22nd Regiment, the Vendeuse, advanced on the left flank of the Canadian assault, they encountered a zone of the Hitler Line that had been identified from aerial photographs as one of the most densely prepared sections of the entire position. 3 Panther turrets covered overlapping arcs of fire across the approach ground. A network of trenches connected them to machine gun positions sited for mutual support. The engineers had confirmed, from the ranging fire of the previous weeks, that the artillery could suppress, but not destroy those turrets from any trajectory available in the valley floor. The plan called for the infantry to advance under fire, reach the turrets, and eliminate them with close-quarters work after the armor had created gaps in the minefield and wire. In the event, 2 of the 3 turrets did not fire after the barrage lifted. The crews inside them had left. They had not been killed by the bombardment. The positions were found intact when the Van Deuce reached them, guns loaded and functional, ammunition stacked and ready. The crews were not among the dead in the surrounding ground. They were among the prisoners taken that morning, identified later in the cages behind the line. The 3rd turret fought until a tank round penetrated the aperture at close range. That crew died at their gun. The difference between the 3 turrets was not in their physical equipment or their tactical situation. It was in the individual composition of the men inside them, and whatever private calculation each crew had arrived at independently in the weeks before the assault. The after-action reports note this kind of disparity across the full length of the line without attempting to explain it, because the tactical accounts were not the place for psychological analysis. The intelligence summaries, compiled from the interrogations, attempt the explanation, and what they arrive at is the observation that the garrison of the Hitler Line was not a uniform body with a single collective morale state, but a collection of individuals and small groups, each of whom had reached their own assessment of the situation, and whose decision in the moment of the assault reflected that individual assessment rather than any collective response to the experience of the battle itself. Some men fought to the end. Some men left their positions at the first safe opportunity. Some men did what the crew of the 3rd Panther turret did, which was fight until the physical situation made surrender or death the only remaining options. The variance was real and it was significant, and the intelligence summary is careful to note that the variance does not support any simple conclusion about the character or the courage of the men involved. What it supports is a more specific conclusion, that the Hitler Line failed because the conditions of the 3 weeks before the assault had produced, in a substantial portion of the garrison, an individual private decision to surrender at the first safe opportunity, and the assault had provided those opportunities in sequence as it moved through the position. The wider context of that conclusion belongs to the history of the Italian campaign as a whole, which is a campaign whose complexity and duration have resisted the kind of clean narrative that makes for memorable history. The war in Italy lasted from July of 1943 to May of 1945, 22 months of fighting across terrain that the official histories describe with a consistent vocabulary of difficulty. Mountains, rivers, mud, rain, narrow valleys where the defender always held the high ground and the attacker always climbed toward it. The German army in Italy, commanded by Kesselring with an operational skill that even his opponents consistently acknowledged, conducted one of the longest and most coherent retreating defenses in the history of modern warfare. They gave up ground when the tactical situation required it, held ground when holding was possible, and maintained a coherent fighting force across 2 years of continuous engagement against opponents who had overwhelming material superiority and consistent air dominance. The Hitler Line was one episode in that defense, and its fall was followed by the Senger Line and the Gothic Line and the winter defensive positions of 1944 to 1945, each of which was breached in turn by the same methods, and each of which produced prisoner testimony with the same underlying themes. What made the Hitler Line distinctive within that sequence was the quality of the unit assigned to hold it, and the specificity of the evidence that the prisoner interrogations produced. The 90th Panzer Grenadier Division was among the best formations remaining in the German order of battle in Italy in May of 1944. Its service in North Africa and Sicily had given it a character and a unit identity that most formations, built and destroyed in the rapid expansion and contraction of the German army, never achieved. The men who served in it understood that they were part of something with a history, and that history had given them a standard against which their own conduct was measured by themselves as well as by their commanders. When those men, in the interrogation cages behind the Canadian lines, said that they had concluded privately and in advance that the Hitler Line would not hold, they were not describing weakness or demoralization in any sense that matches the conventional understanding of those words. They were describing the application of the same analytical competence that had kept the division functional through 2 years of retreat to the specific question of their own situation in the Liri Valley in May of 1944. The analysis produced a conclusion that their orders refused to acknowledge. The conclusion was correct. The Hitler Line fell in 2 days. There is one further element of the prisoner testimony that the intelligence summary addresses without fully resolving, because the evidence for it is consistent, but the mechanism behind it is not entirely clear. Several of the interrogated prisoners, from different units and different sections of the line, describe a change in their assessment of the situation that they located not in the period of general observation during the buildup, but in a specific shorter window, the final 48 hours before the assault. The Canadian artillery had shifted its pattern during those 2 days, moving from the intermittent registration fire of the previous weeks to a sustained program of harassment fire, firing at irregular intervals throughout the day and night onto identified positions. The effect on sleep was significant, the prisoners said, and the effect on sleep was not trivial. Not because sleep deprivation by itself breaks a soldier's will, but because the irregular pattern of the harassment fire, arriving without a schedule that could be adapted to, kept the men in the turret positions and the trench systems in a state of sustained alertness that precluded the kind of extended conversation and reflection that the long stretches of quiet in the previous weeks had allowed. The effect, paradoxically, was to keep them more focused and more functional in the hours immediately before the assault than the preceding weeks had left them. The barrage on the morning of May 23rd was in that sense the continuation of a sequence that had begun 48 hours earlier, and the men in the positions had been operating without adequate sleep for 2 days when the infantry came. The intelligence summary notes this without drawing a firm conclusion about its contribution to the pattern of surrender, because the evidence does not support a clean causal argument in either direction. What it notes is that the prisoners themselves distinguished clearly between the effect of the 3 weeks of strategic observation and the effect of the final 48 hours, and that the 2-day period was described consistently as a narrowing, a reduction in the space available for the private calculation that the preceding weeks had conducted to its conclusion. The Royal Canadian Regiment, advancing on the right flank on the morning of May 23rd, recorded in its war diary the capture of a position that its commanding officer described as presenting no resistance despite being entirely intact when the assault reached it. The entry is brief and factual, the war diary's standard register. The men inside the position were taken prisoner without incident. The position itself was a machine gun emplacement with clear fields of fire over the exact approach the Royal Canadians had used. The gun was loaded. The firing mechanism was undamaged. The crew was unhurt. When the intelligence officer asked the crew why they had not fired, the answer recorded in the diary is a single sentence. They said they had been waiting for a moment when they could surrender safely. That moment had arrived when the Canadian infantry appeared in numbers that made resistance impractical without making surrender dangerous. The crew had been waiting, specifically, for the balance between those two conditions to shift. The shift had occurred when the assault advanced past the positions on either side of them, creating a situation in which surrender to the infantry behind the leading wave was safer than continuing to fire and drawing the attention of the armor. The calculation was precise. The crew had executed it correctly. They gave themselves up to the second wave of the assault and survived the war. That is the Hitler Line as the prisoners described it. A fortification whose physical elements performed as designed, whose human elements had reached a private conclusion about the value of holding it that the orders governing those elements had never addressed and the bombardment had never reversed. The distinction between those two things, the physical structure and the human element inside it, is the distinction that runs through every account of the battle that goes beyond the tactical narrative. The tactical narrative is accurate as far as it goes. 800 guns, 3,000 yards of front, 2 infantry brigades, 1 armor brigade, 2 days of fighting, 879 Canadian casualties, over 1,000 German prisoners, the Hitler Line breached, and the 10th Army withdrawing north. The tactical narrative is the frame. The prisoner testimony is what the frame holds. And what the prisoner testimony holds is an account of professional soldiers doing their individual private arithmetic in an enclosed position over 3 weeks of accumulating evidence, arriving at a conclusion that no order could reverse, and waiting for the safe moment to act on it. The safe moment came in 2 days of fighting that produced serious casualties on both sides. The conclusion had been reached 3 weeks before. The war in Italy continued for another year after the Hitler Line fell. Kesselring's armies conducted their retreat with the same systematic competence they had shown since Sicily, giving ground at cost, and never giving more than the situation required. The Gothic line in the northern Apennines held through the autumn of 1944 and into the winter. The final offensive in April of 1945 broke it in a 2-week campaign that ended with the German armies in Italy surrendering on May 2nd, 3 days before the general surrender in Europe. The record of that final year contains its own prisoner testimony, its own intelligence summaries, its own account of men calculating privately what the orders they were operating under refused to acknowledge. The Hitler Line is one episode in that record. It is the episode that produced the clearest documentation, because the unit involved was coherent enough to reflect on its own experience and articulate it, and because the intelligence officers who conducted the interrogations understood that what they were hearing was worth recording with unusual care. The ground where the Hitler Line stood is farmland again. The concrete emplacements are still there in places, half submerged in the earth after 8 decades of Italian winters, their apertures aimed at a sky that has not held enemy aircraft in living memory. The Panther turret plinths are mostly broken down to their foundations, the steel long since recovered. The Canadian War Cemetery at Cassino holds the men who died in the Italian campaign, including those killed on May 23rd and 24th of 1944, maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission with the same precision as the day the last grave was registered. And in the archives in Ottawa, in the unit war diaries and intelligence summaries that have been available to researchers for decades, the record of what the prisoners said sits in careful handwriting, waiting to be read by anyone who wants to understand not just what happened to the Hitler Line, but why. The concrete did not fail. The wire did not fail. The engineers and the Panther tank designers and the fortification specialists who spent 18 months building the position had produced exactly what they intended to produce. What the record shows, across page after page of prisoner interrogation transcript from 2 days in May of 1944, is that a fortified position is only what the men inside had decided to make it. And those men had made their decision 3 weeks before the Canadian artillery opened, in the accumulating evidence of a campaign that had already told them what it intended to do with them, in the silence of a command structure that gave them orders but not answers, in the specific and private arithmetic of men who had been through enough of the war to know what it looked like when it was ending. That is what the German Paratroopers and Panzer Grenadiers said after the Canadians broke the Hitler Line. The statement is in the archives. The ground is still there. The names are cut in stone at Cassino. The record has survived everything. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen carry the story forward. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.